Hello, my friends. Welcome to tonight's bedtime story. If you're here because you'd like something calm, something gentle, something interesting to listen to while drifting off to sleep, then you've come to the right place. Tonight, we'll be talking about the Freemasons, or simply the Masons, as people usually call them today. You've probably heard the name before, in movies, in novels, in the news. And almost always, the Masons appear surrounded by mystery. Some people imagine them as a powerful brotherhood, pulling the strings of governments. Others see them as a quiet fraternity, what they themselves like to call the craft. In reality, the story of the Masons is both less frightening and much more fascinating than the myths suggest. And I thought, why not share this story with you tonight? Not in a heavy academic way, but like a calm, late-night conversation. So make yourself comfortable. Let the words flow slowly. And if your eyes grow heavy, that's perfectly fine. That's what this bedtime lecture is here for. Oh, and before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way, whenever you need another bedtime history, it will be waiting for you. When people talk about the Masons today, it's often with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Are they just an old-fashioned gentleman's club? Are they a secret society with hidden power? Or are they simply a brotherhood, men meeting in their lodges, calling each other brother and sharing a sense of tradition? The truth, as you'll see, is somewhere in between. It is not about a shadowy conspiracy ruling the world. But it is also not just about dinners and handshakes. The Masons grew out of real history, out of medieval guilds of builders and architects. And over the centuries, their lodges became places where people searched for meaning, for knowledge, and sometimes for influence. We'll walk through that story slowly tonight, step by step, from myths about Noah and Solomon's temple, to the American founding fathers who proudly called themselves Masons. And along the way, we'll stop for some lighthearted details, the kind of funny facts that make the story feel alive. So let's begin this journey together. The Masons are often spoken of in whispers. People say they have secret handshakes. They say there are hidden words, known only to members. Some claim they gather in candlelit halls with strange symbols on the walls. But pause for a moment. What if much of this is simply tradition, rituals passed down over centuries, half serious and half symbolic? It is easy to look at a locked door and imagine something frightening behind it. Yet sometimes, what lies behind that door is much simpler. A group of men discussing philosophy, sharing a meal, or raising funds for charity. Still, the whispers remain. And maybe that's part of the charm. Because mystery, even when harmless, always captures the imagination. And tonight, we will explore both the facts and the myths with a calm voice, one story at a time. When we hear the word Masons, we often imagine secrecy, hidden rooms, closed doors, and most of all, the lodge. A lodge, in simple words, is just the place where Masons meet. Sometimes it is a grand building with columns in front. Sometimes it is a small hall in a quiet town. Inside there may be symbols on the walls, the square, the compass, the letter G. To outsiders, these decorations look mysterious. To members, they are reminders of moral lessons, of tradition, of belonging. The lodge is where ceremonies take place, where new members are welcomed, and where old members gather as a brotherhood. It may sound mysterious from the outside, but step inside and you might find men drinking coffee, debating philosophy, or simply planning their next charity event. The Masons also call themselves the craft. It's an old-fashioned word, a reminder that their roots go back to the craftsmen, the builders, the stoneworkers of the Middle Ages. In their language, being part of the craft means more than just belonging to a club. It means joining a tradition that stretches across centuries, a tradition of working together, supporting one another, and searching for deeper meaning in life. They speak of their members as brothers, and when they gather, they sometimes say they are in lodge, almost like being inside a circle, apart from the outside world. To them, these phrases feel comforting. To outsiders, they can sound mysterious, almost like code words from a hidden society. When people first hear about the Masons, they often wonder, how old is this brotherhood really? Some say it goes back thousands of years. Others insist it began only a few centuries ago. Inside the lodges themselves, especially in the past, members love to tell stories about their origins. One tale said the very first Mason was Adam himself, taught geometry by God in the Garden of Eden. Another legend placed the roots of Masonry with Noah, who built the Ark as if it were the first great Masonic project. And of course, many believed that the builders of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem were the true ancestors of the Masons. These myths were told and retold, not as history, but as ways to give the craft a sense of mystery, of deep connection to the past. And while we now know these are legends, they reveal something important. The Masons always wanted to see themselves as part of a story larger than life. One of the most popular legends centers on a figure named Hiram. According to tradition, King Solomon asked the king of Tyre to send a master builder to help construct the great temple in Jerusalem. That builder was Hiram Abiff, remembered by Masons as the first great master of their craft. The story tells that Hiram held secret knowledge, special words known only to true builders. But when a group of apprentices tried to force him to reveal those secrets, he refused. In anger, they struck him down. Hiram died protecting the sacred words, and his grave was marked by a simple sprig of acacia. For centuries, this story has been acted out in Masonic rituals, not as a record of real events, but as a lesson about loyalty, courage, and the price of guarding knowledge. It is one of the core myths that gave the Masons their sense of drama and mystery. Other legends stretched even further back in time. Some Masons claimed that the builders of the Egyptian pyramids were part of the same great brotherhood. Others pointed to the architects of medieval cathedrals, saying that the soaring spires of Europe carried the hidden mark of Masonry. There were even stories that ancient philosophers, men like Pythagoras or Thales, had secretly been Masons, passing on wisdom through symbols and numbers. To modern ears, these tales sound like myths, but they reveal something about the spirit of Freemasonry. The Masons love to imagine themselves connected to every great act of building, every tradition of hidden knowledge, every attempt to shape the world with stone and with thought. For them, geometry was not just a science. It was almost sacred, the language of the universe itself. Even great scientists were drawn to these ideas. Isaac Newton, for example, spent countless hours studying the description of Solomon's temple in the Bible. He believed that its design was more than architecture. It was a blueprint of the universe itself. For Newton, God was the great architect, and the temple was a miniature model of creation. This way of thinking fit perfectly with the Masonic love of symbols. To them, every tool of the builder carried meaning. The square reminded them to act honestly. The compass urged them to set limits on their desires. The level taught them to see all people as equal. Taken together, these tools formed a moral language, one that transformed ordinary construction into a spiritual lesson. And in that language, the Temple of Solomon became the eternal symbol of hidden wisdom. The myths gave the Masons a sense of ancient dignity, but behind them stood real history. In medieval Europe, groups of stonemasons formed guilds, associations that protected their craft. They built castles, bridges, and the great cathedrals that still rise above European cities today. These guilds had their own traditions. They kept certain techniques secret. They used special words and handshakes to recognize one another. They gathered in small halls to share food, elect leaders, and celebrate their work. These gatherings were the true ancestors of the Masonic Lodge. At first, only working builders could belong, but over time, men of wealth, learning, and influence began to join, even if they never touched stone. And slowly, the Guild of Builders became something more, a brotherhood of ideas. By the 17th century, these guilds were changing. In England and Scotland, gentlemen, scholars, and even nobles were welcomed into the lodges. They were not builders of stone, they were builders of ideas. This shift created what we now call speculative masonry, no longer about cutting stones, but about shaping the mind and the spirit. Members used the old tools of the craft as symbols. They spoke of constructing an inner temple, a moral building within the heart. It was during this time that the word Freemason became widely used. Free, not only in the sense of a craftsman without a master, but free in thought, free in belief, free in brotherhood. And from these beginnings, the myths of Adam and Solomon blended with the real history of guilds, forming the foundation of modern masonry. By the early 18th century, something remarkable happened. The old guilds of working stonemasons were fading. There were fewer cathedrals to build, fewer castles to repair. But the lodges did not disappear. Instead, they began to welcome men who were not builders at all. Gentlemen, philosophers, merchants, even nobles. These men brought new energy, new ideas, and new ambitions into the lodges. And on a summer's day in 1717, in a London tavern called the Goose and Gridiron, 4 small lodges came together. They formed what became known as the Grand Lodge of London. This was the true beginning of modern Freemasonry, no longer tied to stone, but dedicated to thought, morality, and brotherhood. The new Freemasonry was called speculative, not because they speculated in money or trade, but because they no longer worked with stone. Instead, they used the symbols of the builders to talk about human life. The square became a reminder to act fairly. The compass taught men to set limits and control their passions. The level stood for equality, that all men, high or low, should meet on the same ground. This was a bold idea in the 18th century. Inside the lodge, kings and merchants could sit side by side, calling each other brother. It did not erase social divisions, of course, but it offered a taste of equality in a world where hierarchy ruled everyday life. And that taste was powerful. In those early years, the rules of Masonry were written down in new documents. One of the most famous was Anderson's Constitutions, published in 1723. It laid out the duties of a Mason: to obey moral law, to be a good citizen, and to respect the faith of others. Unlike the old guilds, Freemasonry was no longer tied to a single church. A Mason could be Anglican, Catholic, Protestant, or even simply a believer in a supreme being. This was unusual for the time, when religion often divided people sharply. The lodge became a place where men of different faiths could meet as equals. It was not about dogma. It was about shared values. And that openness helped Masonry spread quickly across Europe. By the mid-1700s, lodges were spreading far beyond England. In France, Masonry attracted nobles, writers, and artists who were fascinated by its rituals. In Germany, scholars and philosophers joined, seeing it as a path to wisdom. And across the ocean, in the American colonies, lodges began to appear in busy port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. These lodges often became meeting places for lively discussion, places where ideas about liberty and independence could grow. It is no surprise that many of America's founding fathers were proud Masons. Men like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and Paul Revere all belonged to the craft. For them, Masonry was not just a private fraternity. It was also a source of inspiration for building a new nation. The early lodges were never just about symbols and ceremonies. They were also social spaces, places to gather, to eat, to laugh together. Old records sometimes list expenses like ale and cheese after a meeting. It shows us that fellowship and shared meals were as important as the ritual itself. Imagine a candlelit hall in London, where men debated philosophy one moment, and the next, they were raising a toast, passing bread, and joking like old friends. This balance between seriousness and comfort was part of Masonry's appeal. It was not only about building an inner temple, it was also about friendship, trust, and the warmth of belonging. Of course, not every lodge looked the same. Some were small, with only a handful of members. Others grew quickly, filling large halls with dozens of brothers. Some preferred simple rituals and quiet discussions. Others loved elaborate ceremonies, full of music, costumes, and dramatic oaths. This variety was part of the charm. A traveling Mason could visit another lodge in a different town and feel both the comfort of tradition and the excitement of seeing it done a little differently. It created a network, a sense of belonging that stretched far beyond one's own city. And in a world that was changing fast, that sense of brotherhood meant a great deal. As lodges expanded, so did their language. Masons began calling their meetings labors. When the ritual ended, they said they moved from labor to refreshment. And refreshment usually meant food, wine, and cheerful company. At the table, ordinary words were replaced with playful ones. The table itself was called the workshop. Salt became sand. Spoons were trowels. Glasses were tools. And when they all lifted their drinks together, it was called firing a cannon. This mixture of solemn ritual and light-hearted play made the lodge feel both serious and fun, a safe space where symbols and jokes lived side by side. By the late 1700s, Freemasonry had grown into a full cultural movement. In England, it appealed to gentlemen who wanted both tradition and progress. In France, it drew nobles and intellectuals searching for new ideas. And in America, it became a gathering place for revolutionaries who dreamed of independence. The transition was complete, from builders of stone to builders of philosophy, community, and even nations. The lodge was no longer just a guild hall. It was a stage where Enlightenment values, equality, liberty, and fraternity found a home. And that stage was about to grow larger, spreading across continents. The 18th century was a time of change. Philosophers questioned old traditions. Scientists searched for new truths. Writers and artists explored fresh ways of seeing the world. This period is known as the Enlightenment, an age of reason, curiosity, and discovery. And Freemasonry fit perfectly into this spirit. Inside the lodge, men were encouraged to think for themselves. They debated ideas about freedom, morality, and the purpose of life. They spoke of a supreme architect of the universe, not tied to one religion, but open to many faiths. For many, this was a safe space to explore questions they could not always ask in church or in politics. It was a quiet revolution, one that spread from city to city, lodge to lodge, across Europe and beyond. In England, Freemasonry remained tied to its roots. The lodges were often modest, gatherings of gentlemen in taverns or rented halls. They focused on moral lessons, charity, and fraternity. But in France, Masonry took on a new life. Here it attracted nobles, artists, and thinkers who were eager for mystery and symbolism. French lodges loved elaborate ceremonies, colorful costumes, and layers of hidden meaning. They spoke of ancient wisdom, of knights and crusades, of secret orders stretching back to the Temple of Solomon. For some, it was playful imagination. For others, it was deadly serious, a way to search for a spiritual truth beyond the church. And in the vibrant salons of Paris, Masonic ideas mixed easily with the philosophies of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. In Germany, Freemasonry found a more philosophical tone. Scholars and professors joined, treating the lodge like a classroom of the spirit. They blended Masonic ritual with ideas from mysticism, alchemy, and even the study of nature. Some lodges looked almost like research societies, where lectures were given on astronomy or medicine. Others leaned into mystic visions, searching for hidden truths in numbers and symbols. This mix of reason and mystery gave German Masonry a unique character, and though their style differed from the English or French, they were united by the same idea, that human beings could build a better world, not only with stone and mortar, but with knowledge, virtue, and fellowship. Across the Atlantic, Masonry was growing quickly in the American colonies. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, lodges became places where men gathered not only for ritual, but for conversation. Here they discussed liberty, the rights of man, and the future of their society. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most active Masons of his time. He not only attended meetings, he also published Masonic books and helped organize lodges. George Washington, too, wore the Masonic apron at ceremonies, proud to be called a brother. Even Paul Revere, famous for his midnight ride, was part of the craft. For these men, Masonry offered both fellowship and inspiration. It gave a language of equality and brotherhood, values that would shape the birth of the United States. The influence of Masonry on the American Revolution is often exaggerated, but it cannot be ignored. Lodges provided safe spaces for men to exchange ideas without fear of censorship. In a tavern or lodge room, they could debate freely about independence, democracy, and the rights of the people. Some historians argue that these meetings helped shape the very language of the Revolution. Phrases like liberty, equality, fraternity echoed not only in France, but also in American Masonic halls. And while the Revolution had many causes, Masonry gave it a set of symbols: the square, the compass, the all-seeing eye, that later appeared in American culture. Even today, the back of the $1 bill carries Masonic imagery, the unfinished pyramid topped by the radiant eye. It is less a sign of conspiracy and more a reminder of how deeply Masonry was woven into the imagination of the new nation. The spread of Masonry was not without suspicion. Because meetings were private, outsiders often imagined the worst. Some whispered that Masons plotted revolutions behind closed doors. Others claimed they were guardians of ancient magic. In France, especially during the years leading to the Revolution of 1789, suspicion grew intense. Pamphlets warned of secret societies undermining the throne. Priests accused Masons of trying to replace religion with strange rituals. Yet, many nobles and even members of the royal family attended lodges openly. The irony was clear. While some feared a conspiracy, others treated Masonry like fashionable entertainment. It was both respected and mistrusted, celebrated and condemned, sometimes in the same city at the same time. One of the most famous French Masons was the Marquis de Lafayette. He fought in the American Revolution, returned to France, and became a hero of both nations. In his speeches, he often spoke of liberty as a universal right, an idea that echoed Masonry's values. At the same time, critics accused lodges of stirring unrest. During the French Revolution, many radicals and moderates alike were Masons, which only deepened suspicion. But historians remind us, Masonry did not cause the revolution. Rather, it provided a meeting place, a language of equality, and a sense of fraternity that matched the spirit of the age. In candlelit rooms, men dreamed of freedom, and in the streets of Paris, those dreams erupted into history. By the end of the 18th century, Masonry stretched across continents. From London to Paris, from Berlin to Boston, lodges offered a space where men could gather as equals. They carried symbols of stonework, but used them to build ideas. The compass, the square, the level. They were reminders of honesty, self-control, and equality. In America, these values helped shape a new republic. In France, they became part of the revolutionary language. And in Europe more broadly, they fed the hunger for knowledge and brotherhood that defined the Enlightenment. Masonry had begun as a guild of craftsmen. Now, it was a global movement, both admired and mistrusted, but impossible to ignore. The 19th century was a time of expansion for Freemasonry. Lodges multiplied in cities across Europe and America. Membership grew among politicians, lawyers, businessmen, and community leaders. But as Masonry became more visible, so did suspicion. People asked, what really happens behind those closed doors? Were the Masons simply dining and debating? Or were they secretly guiding governments and revolutions? This mix of curiosity and fear gave rise to a wave of anti-Masonic writings. Pamphlets, newspapers, and preachers warned that the Brotherhood was a threat to church and state. And while most lodges focused on charity and fellowship, the whispers of conspiracy never stopped. In America, suspicion reached a dramatic peak in the 1820s. A man named William Morgan announced that he was writing a book revealing Masonic secrets. Soon after, he mysteriously disappeared. Many believed he had been kidnapped or even killed by outraged Masons. The truth was never proven, but the story spread like wildfire. It sparked outrage across the young nation. For the first time in United States history, a political party was formed against a secret society. It was called the Anti-Masonic Party. They held rallies, published newspapers, and even ran candidates for president. Although the party faded after a few years, it showed how powerful fear of Masonry had become. In Europe, the pattern was similar. Masonry attracted men of influence, generals, writers, scientists, and reformers. But the secrecy of the lodges made governments uneasy. In France, monarchs alternated between tolerating and suppressing the Brotherhood. In Italy, revolutionaries who dreamed of uniting the country often met in Masonic halls. This fueled the belief that the craft was not only a fraternity, but a political engine. In Germany, philosophers joined lodges to discuss freedom and morality. Yet at the same time, conservative leaders denounced them as dangerous dreamers. Everywhere Masonry spread, admiration and suspicion walked hand in hand. It was praised for charity and learning, but feared as a network of hidden power. The fears around Masonry often said more about society than about the lodges themselves. In times of change, people looked for hidden enemies. When revolutions shook Europe, Masons were blamed. When economies faltered, Masons were accused of secret control. Even in small towns, rumors spread that the local lodge was pulling strings behind closed doors. Yet, for most members, life in the lodge was simple. They attended meetings, supported charity, and enjoyed the company of friends. The great conspiracies imagined by critics rarely matched the everyday reality. Still, suspicion was powerful, and it followed the Masons wherever they went. Despite the rumors, Masonry continued to grow in the 19th century. Lodges became centers of charity, funding schools, hospitals, and relief for the poor. In America, Masons marched in parades, laid the cornerstones of public buildings, and proudly wore their aprons. In France and Italy, they were linked with movements for freedom and national unity. And in Britain, the craft flourished under royal patronage. Even kings and princes joined the Brotherhood. This visibility made the Masons seem both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because they were part of daily community life. Extraordinary because the secrecy of their rituals always hinted at something deeper. That mixture, public charity and private mystery, kept Masonry fascinating to friend and foe alike. By the late 1800s, Masonry faced a new kind of suspicion. Nationalism was rising across Europe. Some political leaders claimed that Masons were cosmopolitans, too loyal to Brotherhood, and not loyal enough to their own nation. At the same time, anti-Semitism was spreading. Critics began to mix old fears of secret societies with prejudice against Jews. They spoke of a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, as if Masons and Jewish communities were secretly plotting together. It was pure fantasy, but it was repeated so often that many believed it. These myths would grow darker in the century to come, and they would cast a long shadow over the reputation of Masonry, even as lodges continued their quiet work of charity and fellowship. In America, Masonry also had to rebuild its reputation. The disappearance of William Morgan in the 1820s had left scars. For decades afterward, some citizens avoided lodges, fearing secrecy and corruption. But by the mid-1800s, Masonry was woven once again into civic life. Presidents, governors, and judges openly declared themselves Masons. Public ceremonies, like laying the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol or state buildings, reminded people that the craft was part of national tradition. Still, whispers remained. Was Masonry a noble fraternity, or a hidden power pulling the strings of government? The truth, as always, was less dramatic, but the questions never fully disappeared. By the end of the 19th century, Freemasonry stood at a crossroads. It was larger than ever, with lodges spread across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Its symbols were familiar: the square, the compass, the letter G, seen on buildings and monuments. Its members included kings, presidents, and poets. Yet the myths surrounding Masonry were just as strong as the facts. To some, it was a beacon of charity and brotherhood. To others, it was a shadowy network of hidden influence. This double image, light and shadow, would follow the craft into the 20th century. And in that new century, the myths would turn darker still. The 20th century opened with hope, but also with fear. Industrial cities were growing, new technologies were changing daily life, and politics was becoming more turbulent. In this climate, old suspicions about Freemasonry returned with new force. Pamphlets and speeches warned of secret plots. Conspiracy theories spread faster than facts, and one of the most damaging myths of all was born: the idea of a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. This false story claimed that Masons and Jews were secretly united to control governments and finance. It was complete invention, but it became a powerful tool for those who wanted to spread hate. From Europe to America, the myth began to darken public opinion, even while lodges continued their everyday work. One of the most notorious texts of the early 1900s was called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It claimed to reveal a secret plan for world domination. In reality, it was a forgery, copied from earlier works and filled with lies. But it spread quickly, first in Russia, then across Europe and America. The protocols tied together two old fears: fear of Jewish communities and fear of Freemasons. According to the book, both groups were working hand in hand to overthrow governments and rule the world. It was pure fantasy, yet for many, it felt convincing. The damage was enormous. Even after the forgery was exposed, the myth lived on, feeding anti-Semitism and suspicion of Masonry for decades. During the 1920s and 1930s, authoritarian movements rose in Europe. In Italy, Mussolini viewed secret societies with suspicion. In Germany, the Nazis targeted both Jews and Freemasons, branding them as enemies of the state. Masonic lodges were closed, records were seized, and members were persecuted. Nazi propaganda showed Masons as puppeteers pulling the strings of world politics. Posters and films repeated the lie of a global conspiracy. For many ordinary people, the Brotherhood of the Square and Compass became a frightening shadow, not a friendly fraternity. What had once been symbols of morality and learning were twisted into emblems of fear. And the myths that darkened Masonry's name would linger long after the war ended. In America, the picture was different. Freemasonry remained active, visible in parades, ceremonies, and community service. Presidents like Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry Truman were proud to be Masons. Yet even in the United States, conspiracy theories found an audience. Some preachers warned that the lodge was unchristian. Others claimed Masons were quietly running Washington, D.C. The truth was simpler. Lodges were mostly local clubs, raising money for hospitals, schools, and charities. But myths are stubborn, and in an age of radio, newspapers, and later television, false stories could spread faster than ever before. Popular culture also kept Masonry in the public eye. Writers and filmmakers loved to use the lodge as a setting for mystery. The French novelist Alexandre Dumas wrote of secret brotherhoods and strange rituals. Much later, modern authors like Dan Brown revived those themes for new generations. His novel The Lost Symbol turned Freemasonry into the backdrop for a thriller set in Washington, D.C. These stories were entertaining, but they blurred the line between fact and fiction. For many readers, the drama of hidden chambers and ancient codes seemed more exciting than the quiet reality of lodge meetings. And so, the myths grew stronger than the truth. Even harmless tales added fuel to the fire of suspicion. By the mid-20th century, Masonry had become a mirror of society's hopes and fears. To supporters, it was a fraternity of service and tradition. To critics, it was a secret empire hiding in plain sight. Wars, revolutions, and propaganda had reshaped its image. And although millions of Masons around the world lived ordinary lives, the myths refused to fade. Some saw the square and compass as a promise of brotherhood. Others saw only shadows. This tension carried Masonry into the modern age, where legend and reality still sit side by side. In today's world, Freemasonry is far less mysterious than in centuries past. Lodges often open their doors for community events. Websites explain their history, their symbols, and their goals. Membership is usually public, and many Masons proudly share their affiliation. Yet the old myths never fully disappeared. Some people still imagine hidden rituals and secret plans. Others see the fraternity as nothing more than a social club for older men. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Masonry today is a blend of tradition, charity, and fellowship, wrapped in a cloak of history that keeps the imagination alive. Modern lodges are often involved in charity. They raise money for hospitals, scholarships, and disaster relief. In the United States, one of the most visible groups is the Shriners, famous for their red fezzes and for running children's hospitals. In Europe, many lodges focus on education and cultural programs. The rituals remain, but they are practiced with respect for tradition rather than secrecy for power. Still, to an outsider, the sight of aprons, symbols, and coded handshakes can feel mysterious. That mystery fuels curiosity and sometimes suspicion. But for most members, Masonry is about fellowship, history, and service to the community, not secret control of the world. In America, Masonry still carries echoes of the past. Many historic lodges proudly display artifacts connected to the founding fathers. Tourists can visit George Washington's Masonic apron or Benjamin Franklin's lodge chair. These objects remind visitors that Masonry once stood close to the heart of the nation. At the same time, membership has declined compared to its peak in the mid-1900s. Younger generations are less drawn to formal rituals and long meetings. Yet, some are rediscovering Masonry as a place of tradition in a busy modern world. For them, the appeal is not secrecy, but the sense of continuity, a link to history, preserved in symbols and ceremonies. In France, Masonry still plays a role in public life. Some lodges there are openly engaged in debates about politics, education, and social progress. This reflects a long tradition. Ever since the days of the Revolution, French lodges have been tied to civic ideals. In Britain, the craft remains more reserved. Lodges emphasize ritual, charity, and continuity with centuries of tradition. The contrast is striking. French Masonry often looks outward, while British Masonry looks inward. Yet both share the same foundations: symbols, fellowship, and the belief in building a better self and a better world. Different styles, same roots. Why do myths about the Masons survive even now? Partly because people love mystery. A hidden handshake, a secret word, a candlelit room. These spark the imagination. Partly because history itself has fed suspicion. Revolutions, famous members, and symbols on money have all made Masonry look larger than life. And partly because it is easier to believe in a secret brotherhood than to face the messy truth of politics and society. So the myths endure. But behind them stands a simpler picture, a fraternity of men keeping old traditions alive while trying, in their own way, to serve their communities. Not rulers of the world, just keepers of ritual, history, and fellowship. And so, our quiet journey through the history of the Freemasons comes to an end. We have walked from the myths of Noah and Solomon, to the lodges of London and Paris, to the founding halls of America. We have seen how suspicion and rumor always followed Masonry. Yet, we have also seen the charity, the fellowship, and the search for meaning that inspired its members. Listening to these stories is like walking through a hall of mirrors. Some reflections are true, some are distorted, and some are pure fantasy. But all of them remind us that Masonry has always been a part of the human desire for connection, mystery, and hope. Before we close, let me leave you with a few questions. Do you believe Freemasons are simply a fraternity of tradition and charity? Or do you think there is still something secret, something hidden behind the square and compass? Why do you think people, even today, are drawn to stories of secret brotherhoods and hidden powers? And what do you imagine when you hear the word Masons? I would love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments, and let's see how different our imaginations can be. And if you enjoyed this bedtime story, if you found it calming or thought-provoking, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. I hope it brought you a sense of calm, a touch of mystery, and maybe even a smile at some of the curious facts along the way. The world of the Freemasons is filled with history, with myths, and with questions that will probably never be answered completely. And perhaps that is exactly what keeps it so fascinating. So now, as you drift towards sleep, let the symbols and stories fade gently into dreams. And remember, if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel. It means a lot, and it helps me share more stories like this with you. Good night, my friends, and sweet dreams.